In this video, I'm going to discuss delivering an oral adjudication, which is also known as a reason for decision or RFD. The main purpose of this video is to prepare you for Harthouse's upcoming high school tournaments, which are taking place over the course of the rest of the semester. And for many of you, it might be your first time or one of your first times chairing around and delivering an RFD. Essentially, an RFD involves a detailed justification that explains why each team took each specific ranking in a debate. This video will mainly be tailored towards those with relatively less judging experience and relatively less experience delivering oral adjudications, and will mainly cover three general topics. Firstly, I'll discuss some general tips with regards to note-taking that are useful to keep in mind when preparing your RFD. Secondly, I'll talk about the structure that an RFD typically follows. And thirdly, I'll talk about the main content of an RFD and how you can explain your justifications for team rankings. Finally, at the end, I'll go over some quick reminders about judging and delivering RFDs. So firstly, in terms of preparing for an RFD and some quick tips that are useful for giving clearer justifications. What I found is that something that really helped me deliver clearer and more thorough RFDs was developing a clear system of note-taking and just having a clear system for summarizing each team's main contributions, as well as organizing their ideas and being able to draw upon and recall key things that teams said during the debate round when I discuss my justifications. So in our previous judging video on this channel, we discussed note-taking at more length. So if you're interested in learning more about note-taking generally, I really encourage you to check out that video on our channel. For the purposes of this video, I'll just discuss a couple of key additions that I want to make about note-taking that are specifically relevant to delivering an RFD. So the first thing that I want to mention in terms of a general tip that helps me when I'm preparing RFDs is usually, in addition to just like the master list of like very detailed notes that I've taken on each individual speaker during the debate, I personally find it helpful to also have like a quick summary sheet or a quick cheat sheet that goes through each of the team's cases and their general overall contributions to the debate. So usually, in between speeches or at the end of all the speeches, I like to compile a very quick note, either as a separate note or at the bottom of my detailed notes on each of the speeches. I like to compile a quick summary of what each team's main contributions were. So I'll have a heading for each team. So for example, I'll say opening government, and then I'll have a very quick like 3 to 5 bullet point list of what their main contributions were. So what were the main things that they set out to prove? What were the main things that they successfully proved? And that just gives me a clear picture or summary of what each team's overall contributions were in the round, and lets me see each of their main contributions at once, which often makes it easier for me to draw upon their main arguments rather than if I had to like scroll through my entire detailed list of notes as I was delivering the oral adjudication. The second thing that I like to do that helps me deliver clearer RFDs is, in addition to having this short summary list of each of the team's main contributions, what I like to add to that is under each bullet point of what each team's main contribution was, I also like to add a very quick note that summarizes my general verdict or my general conclusion about this contribution or this argument and how it interacted with the rest of the round. So underneath my quick summary of opening government, I might say next to each argument or beneath each argument, a quick note about how it interacted with the rest of the round. So I might say something like, this was thoroughly refuted by opening opposition, or this point was not sufficiently refuted, or this point was underanalyzed or was analyzed enough, or this point did a really good job implicitly engaging with closing opposition. I'll just make like a very quick note that just like quickly summarizes my thoughts or my overall conclusion about this contribution and how it interacted with the rest of the debate. I find this helpful because not only do I have like this quick summary sheet that's apart from my detailed list of notes that summarizes what each team's contributions were, but it also quickly summarizes what my main thoughts were on each of the contributions and how they interacted with other things in the debate. And that's a very useful tip for me to be able to draw upon the main cases of each team, as well as quickly remember how certain arguments interacted with the rest of the round. So that's the second main thing that I like to do. The third main tip I have in terms of note taking and preparing for your RFD is it's often a good idea to just take a couple of seconds during deliberation to just gather your thoughts and write down some additional notes for things that you want to mention in the RFD or things that you specifically want to address. In much the same way that we expect speakers to take notes before giving their speeches, it's really, really helpful for adjudicators to take quick notes on things that they want to address in the RFD ahead of time, just so it makes sure that you stay on track and don't forget any important things that you want to mention. So those are my overall tips in terms of additional things that you can do in note taking to try and make sure you have a clearer RFD or you have a clearer picture of the round. So firstly, just making sure you have a quick summary of each of the team's main contributions, which includes what their main ideas were, as well as a quick jot point of how those ideas interact with other teams in the round, as well as just making other general notes that you want to mention in the RFD. So secondly, I want to now discuss the main structure of an RFD and how it's usually presented in a round. So there are multiple different ways that different judges like to present RFDs, so I'll go through a couple and explain my preferred method as well. So the first main method that different judges like to use to structure their RFDs is going through the teams in order of the ranking they took in the debate. So for example, you could go top down by explaining here's why a team took the first, and here's why the team took the second, here's why the team took the third, and here's why the team took the fourth. Or you could explain bottom up, going from the fourth all the way up to the first. This is my preferred method of going through RFDs just because it most clearly explains why teams took their specific ranking and how they compared directly to other teams that were better than them or worse than them. And I find that it gives me the most direction to talk about why teams took specific rankings. I want to highlight a couple of things about this method that are important to keep in mind when you're giving RFDs. The first thing is when you're giving RFDs in order of ranking, make sure that you are not just structuring your RFDs by saying here's why the team that took a first beat the team that took a second. Here's why the team that took a second beat the team that took a third. And you're kind of only talking about why each team beat the team that's directly adjacent to it. Make sure you're talking about why each team beat each other subsequent team that was above or below it. So for example, it's important to explain not only why the team that took a third took it below the team that took a second, but also explain why the team that took a third lost to both the team that took a second and also the team that took a first. So it's useful to make comparisons not just between adjacent teams, but also explaining why each of the teams beat each subsequent team that was above or below it. The reason why that's helpful is that sometimes in RFDs, what judges fall into the trap of doing is making it very, very clear why a team beat the team that was directly below it, but not necessarily why it beat the team that was 2 steps below it or 2 steps above it. So sometimes teams have questions about why they lost to the first ranked team if they took the third or the fourth, even if you made it really, really clear why they lost to the team that they were directly adjacent to. So when I give RFDs, I always try to highlight quickly why the rankings took place in that linear way. So why not only the third place team lost to the second place team, but also why they lost to the first place team. So make sure you have a comparison between each team worked in there. The second thing I'll highlight about giving RFDs according to ranking is that whether I go top down or bottom up is usually dependent on which rankings were most contentious in the round or which rankings were closest in the round. So I often try to spend the first bit of an RFD or like the main part of the RFD discussing the most contentious clashes between teams in the round. So if the third and the fourth were really, really close, I might start with that and move from the bottom up. Or if the first and the second were really, really close, I might start with that and move top down, just because it helps to give yourself enough time to explain the most contentious clashes and make sure you've clearly explained the closest clashes that might be the most challenging to explain. So that's often how I decide whether to go top down or bottom up. So that's the first main way to structure an RFD, going in order of ranking and explaining why each team took its ranking relative to each other team. The second main method that a lot of judges use to structure their RFDs is do it chronologically. So a lot of judges start off with opening government and just saying opening government provided these main arguments, and then opening opposition responds by saying these main things and providing these arguments, and clashing those two teams first, and then explaining how closing government fits into the picture and why they beat or don't beat both of the opening teams, and then talking about closing opposition, comparing closing opposition to the three other teams in the debate. This has certain advantages insofar as it lets you compare each team to each other team, and it helps you tell a story about how the round unfolded and often make sure that you don't miss certain details. So this is also a good method of giving an RFD. I personally prefer to give RFDs by ranking because it gives me a clearer direction or a clearer picture of how to explain how each team took it above or below another team, and to make sure I don't get sidetracked by describing every detail of the round. But whatever works best for you is totally fine, whether or not that's going through the ranking order or going chronologically according to what happened in the debate. Either way you choose, just make sure you are explaining why each team beat not only the team that's adjacent to it, but also every other team in the round. So thirdly, I want to talk about how you can explain your justifications between teams in the debate. So let's say, for example, you're explaining the justification between opening government and opening opposition. The first thing that I often like to start with when I'm comparing two teams is give a very, very quick, 20 to 30 second summary of just what each team's main contributions were. And this is where the quick summary sheet of what each team's case comes in handy. So I like to quickly summarize, here's what opening government said. These are their main three contributions compared to here's what opening opposition said. Here are their main two contributions to the round. I find this helpful, firstly, for the sake of the teams. It makes sure that the teams in the round feel that you as the judge were listening to each of their contributions, and you as the judge have a clear picture of what their overall case was. Often, if you jump right into the clash between the two teams, it might not be fully clear that you caught every single important contribution from their case. And secondly, I think it's a good segue to being able to talk about how the two cases interact with each other and clash with each other. So I usually like to give a quick summary of what each team's main contributions were when I first mentioned them in the RFD. Then I do a couple of things to explain the clashes between each teams. So there are a couple of things you should highlight when you explain the clashes between two opposing teams and why one side won out compared to the other. So firstly, you obviously want to mention the arguments themselves, the strength of each of the arguments, how well they were constructed, and then you'll want to go into engagement. So you'll look at refutation as to how each team responded to each argument, and you'll evaluate the quality of the most important piece of refutation and why certain pieces of refutation were effective at taking down arguments or others might have been less effective, and ultimately deciding why certain arguments and certain pieces of refutation were more salient. Finally, you'll also want to look at things like the implicit engagement, so not just explicit refutation and rebuilding, but also between the two arguments, which team explained that their arguments were more important, or which arguments were framed as being more impactful, which ones were ultimately more important in the adjudication. And so what you're ultimately explaining when you're comparing two different teams is, after you've given a quick summary of their cases, you'll explain, okay, here are the responses that each team gave to another. Here are why certain responses were really effective, and here's why there were also effective implicit responses. Here's why certain arguments were more important than another. And so those are all justifications that you might give to explain why certain teams took it above or below each other. So that specifically applies for teams that are on opposing benches. So the example being opening government versus opening opposition. You'll want to compare the cases as well as the engagement between them. When you're looking at teams that are on the same bench, so for example, two government teams that are on the same bench, obviously you won't really be looking at the refutation between those teams, but what you'll instead be trying to look at when comparing an open government to a closing government is, after you've summarized exactly what the closing government contribution is, you'll want to explain why this contribution succeeded or didn't succeed at proving that it was sufficiently new or important or more valuable than the opening government team. So when you're evaluating a closing team relative to an opening team that were on the same bench, you'll want to think through not only whether this was a new contribution, but whether this contribution was proven by the closing team to be valuable and important compared to what their opening provided. And that might be because it was more impactful. It might be because it was better analyzed. It might be because they filled a critical hole in the opening government case that was necessary for the government case. And for any reason that has been shown to be a critical component of the case. So essentially, when you're comparing opening and closing teams that are on the same bench, you'll want to look at the relative importance of each of those cases and why teams explain that their cases were really, really important. So those are all things that you should be looking at, or things that you can bring into your explanations when you're talking about comparisons between each teams and ultimately why each team took it above or below each other. So to summarize, you'll want to look at between teams on different sides. You'll want to look at the general cases and contributions each team gave, as well as the engagement between those teams, and then the weighing of which arguments were more important. Similarly, on closing, you'll want to look at the relative cases, as well as which arguments were more important on each team. So finally, I want to talk very quickly about some quick reminders of judging and other things involved with RFDs. So firstly, a lot of the times at high school tournaments, you'll be requested for individual or personalized feedback after the round. A lot of the times RFDs are mostly focused on team comparisons, so you might not get the chance to talk about specific individual feedback. So you'll often get messages about individual feedback. Please try and make sure you're responding to requests for feedback. It's really, really helpful for learning purposes, and it's really, really useful for students to get individual feedback on things that they could personally improve. Another main reminder is keep in mind that at hard-ass high schools, in order to keep rounds running on time, deliberations and RFDs should both be kept to 15 minutes. So if you are chairing and delivering an RFD, please make sure you time your RFD just so you can make sure you can effectively manage your time while you're giving feedback to teams. So overall, what we talked about are firstly, general tips involved with note-taking and how to prepare for an RFD. Secondly, how to structure an RFD and different methods that people use. And thirdly, various things you can discuss to explain the justifications for each team. So that covers this session on RFDs. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and hope you have fun at our high school tournaments.